They rushed her into the emergency room, but the doctors knew the truth the second they saw her. A 3-year-old girl, lifeless, her tiny body battered with old and new bruises, covering every inch of her skin. They tried to save her anyway, but it was already too late. Her name was Poppie van der Merwe, and what happened to her wasn't just murder. It was a slow, relentless assault on a defenseless child who never stood a chance. But this isn't just a crime story. No, it is an exposure of the system that failed, the mother who turned her back, and the stepfather whose cruelty knew no limits. Because here's the part that's hardest to accept. People knew and they heard the screams. They saw the bruises and they watched the signs unfold again and again. Yet no one saved her. Her teachers saw her brother flinch when touched. Neighbors heard her crying at night. The social workers had their warnings. And still, Poppie suffered, until there was nothing left of her to save. We like to believe that children are protected, that there are safety nets, families, schools, neighbors, authorities watching over them, stepping in before it's too late. But as you'll see, sometimes the people who should protect them the most are the first to betray them. This is Poppie's story, and it's not one you'll forget. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. Some children carry a light within them, a rare innocence that makes the world pause and take notice. Poppie van der Merwe was one of those children. Born on August 9, 2013 in South Africa, she was a vision of pure beauty. Blonde curls that framed her delicate face, blue eyes so bright they seemed to hold entire stories within them. She was the kind of child strangers stopped to admire, the kind who made people smile without even trying. One neighbor would later recall how people often whispered about her, calling her a porcelain doll, so fragile and perfect that she hardly seemed real. But porcelain is delicate, easily shattered with the slightest pressure, and Poppie's world was filled with fractures that no one could see at first glance. Behind the tiny giggles and the playful innocence was a life suffocating under the weight of something much darker. From the moment she was born, danger was closing in. It lurked in the shadows of her home, creeping closer with every passing day. The people who should have protected her, who should have wrapped her in love and safety, were the very ones who ensured she would never make it past her 3rd birthday. But it all began long before she was born. It began with the story of Louisa, her mother. If you want to understand the choices Louisa Koekemoer made, you have to go back to the very beginning, where the seeds of destruction were first planted. She never had a childhood filled with warmth or love. At 10 years old, she lost her father, the only person who had ever shown her kindness, and in his absence, something cruel took root in her life. Her mother remarried, and with that came a man who saw no value in gentleness. He was a tyrant, a man who demanded submission through fists and fear, who made sure that everyone under his roof knew their place. There was no love in that house, no safety, only the understanding that love and pain were forever intertwined. Louisa was shaped by that pain. She learned early on that silence was survival, that seeking validation from the wrong people was better than having no one at all. And so, when she was finally old enough to leave, she ran straight into the arms of the first man who would take her. His name was Freddie, and in her desperate mind, he was supposed to be an escape. But men like Freddie don't save women like Louisa. They destroy them. He was cruel, just like her stepfather, a man who thrived on control, who knew exactly how to make her feel small. She stayed longer than she should have, enduring, waiting, believing that maybe if she was just a little more obedient, a little more careful, things would change. But they never did. Eventually, she found the strength to walk away. She tried again with Christo van der Merwe, a man who, for a while, seemed different. He was stable, hard-working, the kind of man who looked like he could provide a future. They got married. They had Johan in 2011. And then in 2013, Poppie was born. For a time, everything seemed okay. But if there was one thing Louisa should have known by now, It was that abusers don't show their true nature right away. It starts with small things. The way he grips your arm just a little too tight. The way his voice shifts from tender to harsh in the span of a second. And then one day, the mask drops completely. Cristo became possessive, paranoid, and eventually violent. The man she had built a family with had turned into a stranger, one who saw her not as a wife, but as something he owned. By 2014, when Poppie was barely a year old, Louisa had finally had enough. She filed for divorce. But men like Cristo don't just let go. He threatened her, told her leaving wouldn't be as easy as she thought. At one point, he even threatened to kill her. She did what she could. She got a restraining order. The court limited his access to children. 3 supervised visits a month. 1 weekly phone call, all recorded. It should have been enough. But restraining orders are just pieces of paper. They don't stop fists, and they don't erase the fear that lingers long after the bruises fade. Louisa knew that as long as Cristo existed in their lives, she would never be free. So she did what she had always done. She ran. She packed up what little she had, took her children, and disappeared into the quiet town of Orania, 500 kilometers away from the past that haunted her. Orania was a place like no other, a small, predominantly white settlement, isolated from the chaos of the outside world. With a population of just over 1,000, people moved there to escape, to live simply, to find a sense of safety in a world that felt increasingly unstable. For Louisa, it seemed like the perfect place to start over. The community welcomed her. They helped her find a home, a job at the local supermarket, and even guided her through the final stages of her divorce. It was the first time in a long time that she felt like she was standing on solid ground. But the greatest blessing of all came in the form of a teenage girl, Marissa. Marissa was Louisa's 14-year-old daughter from her first marriage, and when she came to live with them, everything changed. For the first time, Johan and Poppie had someone who truly cared for them. Marissa wasn't just a stepsister. She became their protector, their caregiver, the one who made sure they ate, who held them when they cried, who kissed their foreheads and told them they were loved. She became the mother Louisa never was. And for a while, there was peace. For the first time in their short lives, Johan and Poppie had something close to happiness. But happiness in Louisa's world never lasted long. Because soon, another man would enter their lives. And this time, he wouldn't just ruin Louisa. He would destroy everything. By 2015, Louisa believed she was finally stepping into a new chapter of her life. She had endured a childhood filled with torment, followed by one abusive relationship after another. But now, she was convinced that her suffering had led her to something better. She had moved to a quiet town, built a new life, and found someone who, at least on the surface, seemed like the stability she had been craving. That someone was Kobus Koekemoer. To those who didn't look closely, he seemed like an ordinary man, broad-shouldered, whether from years of manual labor, with an air of confidence that made him seem dependable. He had a steady job, spoke with authority, and carried himself like someone who had everything under control. In a town like Orania, where people value structure and security, a man like that didn't raise immediate concerns. But darkness doesn't always make itself known right away. Kobus had been married twice before, and while he never spoke much about his past, the facts spoke for themselves. 2 failed marriages. 2 children from different women, neither of whom he had any real connection with. No birthday calls, no weekend visits, no childlike drawings pinned his fridge. The only time he acknowledged their existence was when the courts forced him to pay child support, and even then, it was with bitter reluctance. If anyone asked, he would wave it off with a practiced shrug and a muttered, "They turned against me." But his ex-wives told a very different story. They described a man who was not just cold but calculated, someone who knew how to mold himself into the perfect partner until the moment he no longer needed to pretend. They called him merciless, a man who thrived on control, a man whose kindness was nothing more than a performance. When the mask slipped, what lay beneath was pure cruelty. And now he had found Louisa. She was vulnerable, easy to manipulate, and desperate to believe that someone could love her. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She saw what she wanted to see. And before long, Kobus was living in her home, playing the role of devoted partner, positioning himself as the new father figure in her children's lives. By November 2015, they were married, and the very next day, everything changed. Johan and Poppie were innocent children, but to Kobus, they were nothing more than obstacles. They weren't his. They weren't part of his plan, and their presence alone seemed to irritate him. But there was one person who truly loved them, who had protected them from the chaos of their mother's life, who had been their only source of comfort and safety. That person was Marissa. She had been a stabilizing force, stepping in where Louisa had failed, giving Johan and Poppie the love and attention that every child deserved. She made sure they ate, that they were bathed, that someone was there to hold them when they were scared. And that's exactly why she had to go. The morning after the wedding, Kobus made his decision. There was no discussion, no warning, no chance for goodbyes. Marissa was put on a bus and sent back to her father. And just like that, she was gone. The only person who had been shielding Johan and Poppie was ripped away from them, and for the first time, they were completely alone. With her out of the way, Kobus turned his full attention to the children. At first, it was subtle. A harsh tone, a sharp look, a sudden movement that made Johan flinch. Poppie, too young to understand the shift in their home, would instinctively shrink back whenever Kobus entered the room. Then, the real cruelty began. What started as yelling quickly escalated into slaps. The slaps became shoves. The shoves turned into punches. The so-called punishments became systematic, relentless beatings. And Louisa? She let it happen. Whether it was fear, resignation, or sheer detachment, she did nothing to stop it. She had spent her life enduring abuse, and now, it was as if she had come to accept it as normal, as something that just happened. Johan and Poppie were trapped in a house that was no longer a home, where their cries for help went unanswered, where the one person who was supposed to protect them had chosen not to. And the people who should have noticed, they saw the signs. They just didn't act fast enough. It started at kindergarten. Johan, once an energetic and curious little boy, became withdrawn. He stopped playing with other children. He barely spoke. If someone raised their voice, even in laughter, he would tense up, as if bracing for impact. Then he started hiding in the bathroom. Every day, he would lock himself inside, refusing to come out until teachers coaxed him. They didn't understand why. They thought maybe he was just a shy child, maybe he needed space. And then there was the clothing. No matter how hot it was outside, he always wore a jacket. Always. It didn't make sense. Other kids would shed their layers the moment they ran outside to play, but Johan clung to his jacket as if his life depended on it. One day, a teacher gently tried to remove it. He snapped. He fought, he resisted, he screamed. And when they finally managed to roll up his sleeve, they understood why. Bruises. Dark, ugly, covering his arms in places no child should ever have them. And then there was Poppie. She was only 3 years old. Too young to process what was happening to her. Too young to understand that this was not what childhood was supposed to feel like. But she knew enough to be afraid. She knew enough to try and tell someone. She would go up to her teachers, pointing at her bruises, babbling in broken sentences, trying to explain. But she was still learning to speak, and her words didn't always make sense to the adults around her. She would say things like, boom, a loud noise, ow, pain, or Kobus mad. She was trying so hard to tell them, but no one understood. No one knew she was begging for help. And so the abuse continued, day after day, beating after beating, until one day it finally went too far. The day Poppie wouldn't wake up. The truth is, someone always sees. There are always signs. There are always whispers. There are always opportunities to stop the nightmare before it reaches the point of no return. But in Poppie's case, those opportunities came and went, slipping through the cracks in neglect, silence, and outright indifference. Her home was not just a house. It was a prison, a battlefield, a place where love had no place, and fear ruled every second of the day. The walls absorbed the violence. The bruises told the stories, and yet no one really listened. Neighbors heard the screams. The walls were thin. The cries of a child in pain. The deep, guttural roars of a man with no soul left in him. It was impossible to miss. They heard the thuds, the sharp slaps, the muffled cries. At kindergarten, teachers noticed the bruises. At first, it was little things, a scrape here, a bump there. Kids fall, kids play rough. It happens. But then the bruises started appearing in places that made no sense. On her ears, on her inner arms, and on her rib sides. They saw the stiffness in the way she walked, the way she winced when she sat down, the way she avoided eye contact when anyone asked too many questions. One day, Poppie came to school with her arm wrapped in a cast. Louisa had a ready-made explanation. Poppie had fallen. She was clumsy, always bumping into things. But the teachers had a feeling. It just wasn't strong enough. They asked, they pushed, but Louisa had an answer for everything. Johan is aggressive, or Poppie falls a lot, or children play rough. Each time, she looked them dead in the eye and lied so smoothly that, for a moment, they almost believed her. And then there was social services. The reports were there. The concerns had been raised. But time and time again, they came to the same conclusion. Nothing to be concerned about still, because children are active and bruises do happen. There was no proof of abuse, so no action was taken. Poppie went home. The door shut, and the monster was waiting. What happens to a child who learns that no one is coming to save them? What happens to a little girl who realizes that no matter how much she cries, no one will hold her? Poppie was only 3 years old, and yet she already knew how to suffer in silence. At night, she woke up screaming. The nightmares came often, the kind that weren't just dreams but memories, replaying over and over. The shadows that lurked in the corners weren't monsters from bedtime stories. They were real, and they had names, and they had fists too. She cried in the dark, hoping for someone, anyone, to come and hold her, to tell her she was safe. But no one came. Instead, she was silenced, not with words, not with comfort, with pain. If she cried too loudly, she was beaten, and if she whimpered in fear, she was ignored. So she learned quickly. She learned to cry without making a sound. She learned to press her little hands over her mouth, to sob as quietly as possible so that she wouldn't wake the monster in the next room. She was starved, and days went by when she wasn't fed. Her tiny body, already fragile, became weaker, her arms thinner, her stomach empty. But in a world where so many turn a blind eye, there was one man who saw the truth and refused to look away. He wasn't a hero in a traditional sense, just an ordinary neighbor who lived close enough to hear the violence echo through the thin walls, to witness the small, heartbreaking signs of a child slipping through the cracks. But unlike the others, he tried to help, again and again. He heard the fights, the shouting, the cries of a child in pain that would cut through the silence of the night, making it impossible to sleep. He knew those weren't the sounds of ordinary discipline, of a child being scolded for bad behavior. This was different. This was cruelty. This was suffering. And then there was the night he would never forget, a cold evening, the kind where the chill settles deep into your bones. He stepped outside for some fresh air when he saw something that made his stomach turn. Poppie, standing in the yard, soaking wet, shivering uncontrollably. Kobus stood over her, his voice low and threatening. Whatever crime she had supposedly committed didn't matter. The punishment was the same: humiliation, pain, and suffering. The neighbor could have walked away. He could have told himself it wasn't his business. But he didn't. He tried to intervene. He asked Kobus what he was doing, why the child was standing outside in the cold like that. Kobus just laughed. "She needs to learn," he said. "Learn what? That no one was coming to save her? That pain was the only thing she could count on?" The neighbor went inside that night, but the image of Poppie standing there, drenched and shaking, haunted him. It wasn't just discipline, it was torture, and he knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, he went straight to social services. He reported what he had seen, and they ignored him, but he didn't give up. Each time the screams grew louder, each time he saw the bruises, each time he noticed Johan and Poppie shrinking further into themselves, he filed another report. Again and again, he knocked on doors. He told officials what was happening. And every time, The response was the same. Children play rough, or bruises happen, or there's no proof. Even the police were out of reach. The nearest station was 40 kilometers away. The officials didn't see what he saw. They didn't hear the screams at night. They had paperwork. He had evidence. But somehow, the paperwork mattered more. After months of relentless complaints, social services finally acted, but not in the way they should have. Instead of taking Poppie and Johan away from their abusers, instead of removing them from that house of horror, they gave Louisa and Kobus a chance to fix things. They were forced into therapy. They were ordered to take the children for weekly medical checkups. It sounded good on paper, a sign that someone, somewhere, was finally paying attention. For a short time, things seemed to improve. Louisa and Kobus attended a few counseling sessions. They took the children to the doctor twice. But that was it. They never intended to change. They were just playing along, doing the bare minimum to keep up appearances. And when they decided they were done, they simply stopped going. It was October 24th, 2016. Somewhere in that house, a clock was ticking. Poppie's time was running out, and she didn't even know it. She was just 3 years old, too young to understand that her body was shutting down, too young to know that soon the pain would stop forever. That morning, Louisa claimed that Poppie had hit her head on a cupboard, a flimsy excuse, the kind she had given 100 times before. But this time, the damage was different. By the next morning, Poppie wasn't herself. Her tiny body, so used to fighting, was shutting down. Her little face, usually so expressive, was blank, the spark in her big blue eyes gone. And her brother, Johan, saw it happening at just 5 years old. He understood what no child should ever have to understand. "Poppie doesn't want to eat anymore," he whispered. Those were his words, his way of saying what he couldn't fully grasp. His sister was slipping away right in front of him. And what did Louisa do? Did she scoop Poppie into her arms and rush her to a hospital? Did she finally fight back against the monster in her house? No, she begged him. She begged Kobus to leave Poppie alone. But Kobus wasn't the kind of man to listen. One last kick, a hard, merciless blow to her tiny stomach. Poppie crumpled. And Louisa? She left. She walked out of the house. Left her dying daughter alone with a man who had already taken everything from her. By the time she returned, Poppie wasn't moving, nor was she wasn't crying. She wasn't even blinking. She was limp and unconscious. But even then, even with her child's fragile body barely clinging to life, they didn't call for help. They didn't rush to save her. They didn't cradle her, whispering apologies, begging her to hold on. No, they threw her. They threw her into the back of a pickup truck, like she was nothing, like she wasn't a child, like she wasn't human. The road was rough, and every bump, every sharp turn, her tiny, broken body was tossed around like cargo. And by the time they reached the hospital, it was already too late. The moment they carried her inside, the doctors knew. They didn't need a long explanation. They didn't need to hear Louisa's pathetic excuses, because Poppie's body told the truth. She wasn't just bruised. She was covered in them. Some were fresh and others were healing. Some were dark purple, others yellowing, evidence of wounds that had been inflicted days, even weeks before. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a single blow. This was systematic, relentless torture. And then there was Johan, standing in the corner, small, scared, eyes darting back and forth, muttering to himself. When a doctor knelt down, speaking softly, asking him what had happened, he didn't cry. He didn't explain. He only said one thing. Poppie no longer wants to eat. A child's way of saying the unthinkable. His sister was gone. The doctors didn't hesitate. They picked up the phone and called the police. Louisa and Kobus tried to stop them. They pleaded. They begged, not out of love, not out of guilt, but out of sheer, selfish desperation. They weren't afraid of what they had done. They were afraid of getting caught. But this time, no amount of lies, no well-rehearsed excuses, no manipulative sob stories could save them. The nightmare they had created was about to end, and justice was coming. When the news of Poppie's murder spread, the country was outraged because this wasn't just another case of domestic violence. This was evil. In fact, People weren't just angry, they were seething. And no one felt that rage more than the people closest to crime, because in Orania, they had welcomed Louisa. They had helped her settle in, believing she was an abused woman, trying to build a better life for her children. They had offered support. And now they found out the truth, that she wasn't just a mother who failed to protect her child. She was part of it. The moment Kobus was locked behind bars, the other inmates knew who he was. Child killers are the lowest of the low in prison. There's no respect for them, no mercy. And it didn't take long before they made sure he understood that. He was beaten, again and again, threatened. Some prisoners wanted him dead, and guards had to step in more than once to pull him out of the chaos. But deep down, no one really wanted to save him. It wasn't justice, but it was something. At first, Louisa was seen as a victim, a battered woman, forced into silence, too terrified to fight back against a man like Kobus. And maybe, for a brief moment, people wanted to believe that, but the neighbors didn't. They knew. They had heard her laughing with him. They had seen her look the other way. They had watched her send Marissa away, leaving her two youngest children alone with a monster. And they weren't willing to wait for the court to decide her fate. So they took matters into their own hands. Two women, dressed in police uniforms, showed up at her door, and they told her she needed to come with them to give a statement. So she didn't hesitate. She went willingly, still convinced that she would be seen as a victim. But they didn't take her to a station. No, rather, they took her outside the town, and they beat her badly. By the time she arrived at Poppie's funeral, her face was swollen, her body bruised, her lips split. She sat there, silent. No one looked at her with pity, because for them, this was the closest thing to justice they would get. And then there was Louisa's own mother. She had been one of the few people who suspected something was wrong. She had seen the bruises. She had tried once to ask questions. She had even gone to the local pastor for help, hoping he would step in. But she didn't go to police, and now her granddaughter is dead. At the funeral, she didn't cry. Maybe she was numb, or maybe she was guilty, or maybe she had finally accepted that she had failed Poppie, just like everyone else. Then there was Christo van der Merwe, Poppie's biological father, a man who had been pushed out of her life, a man who, after the divorce, was only allowed supervised visits, only allowed to speak to his children through monitored calls. And now, he was sitting at his daughter's funeral, watching her be lowered into the ground. There were tears in his eyes. He wasn't quiet about his feelings. He blamed Louisa, and he said outright, she had always been a bad mother. He sat in the front row, surrounded by family, while Louisa sat off to the side, unwanted, unwelcome. The weight of her actions was crushing her, but no one offered her comfort, because no one believed she deserved it. When the trial began, the public already knew the verdict they wanted. There was no sympathy for Louisa anymore. Whatever excuses she had once used, whatever lies she had told to make herself look like the victim, they didn't matter anymore, because Johan had spoken, because the truth had come out, because there was no defense for what she had done. But even with overwhelming evidence, the trial didn't start immediately. It was delayed. Not because of lack of evidence. No, not because of legal complications, but because no one wanted to defend them. Even their court-appointed lawyers didn't want the case. They walked away in disgust, refusing to represent them. No one wanted their names attached to child killers. For an entire year, the trial was postponed until finally, there was no more running, no more excuses. And when the judge looked at Louisa and Kobus, he didn't see parents, he didn't see people. He saw monsters, and he made sure they never walked free again. Life in prison. No parole. For Louisa, for Kobus, and for Poppie, too little, too late. Poppie should have been safe. She should have been a little girl who ran barefoot in the grass, who laughed too loud, who came home with scraped knees and messy hair from playing too hard. She should have had birthday parties, bedtime stories, warm hugs. Instead, she was starved, beaten, silenced. Instead, she died alone in pain, knowing that no one was coming to save her. But maybe, just maybe, there's still time to save the next child. Maybe next time, someone will knock on the door. Maybe next time, someone will push harder. Maybe next time, someone will make that call before it's too late. Because Poppie never stood a chance. But the next child might. Which part of this story touched you the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop your comments below and share your theories with us. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories like this one. Stay tuned for more disturbing cases. And as always, thank you for watching.